Before a man can truly meet the anima, his inner feminine, he must first build something most were never taught to construct, a masculine container. This isn't about muscles or bravado, but about cultivating a stable ego structure capable of holding the unpredictable waters of feeling and emotion. Without this container, the anima floods the psyche, often showing up as projection, obsession, or chaos. Masculinity, in its deeper psychological form, isn't rigid control. It's conscious direction, spiritual development, and psychological homeostasis in action. Think of it like preparing a sacred vessel before pouring in wine. Without the form, the essence spills. The anima doesn't arrive politely. She crashes through dreams, fantasies, and relationships, demanding attention. But if the ego hasn't undergone enough adaptation, hasn't faced the unconscious with humility, she becomes destructive. Men often blame women for their own disorientation. Unaware, they're facing their own inner feminine through an external mirror. Integrating the anima means taking radical responsibility for the projections we cast. Jungian psychology shows us that this inner confrontation is non-negotiable for real transformation. A grounded man knows how to relate to both his instincts and his ideals, navigating between inner world and outer world with clarity. That's the job of the masculine ego, to serve as an effect bridge between unconscious contents and conscious action. If that bridge is cracked, the contents of the anima either slip through unnoticed or explode in maladjusted forms. Depression, addiction, obsession. Masculinity here is not domination. It's conscious containment, so that what's wild can find shape. So how does one start? Begin with ritual. Simple, grounded practices that center the ego. Journaling emotional reactions, practicing breath work, lifting weights with symbolic intention, or even drawing daily archetypal imagery to explore inner dynamics. Creativity and discipline work hand in hand to shape a psychological immune system capable of withstanding the anima's fire. Remember, you're not taming her, you're meeting her. She tests the strength of the vessel by filling it. And if the container isn't ready, the unconscious won't wait. She'll seep through the cracks. That's why so many men feel haunted by dreams or pulled into confusing emotional spirals. They haven't built a place for her to land. But when the vessel is strong, the anima becomes muse, guide, and source of gnosis. She activates instincts, calls forth meaning, and stirs imagery that leads to personal myth. Yet, to move from concept to contact, we must deepen our understanding of what we actually feel, and not just what we think we feel. Emotion, feeling, and the role of depth psychology. Let's get one thing straight. Most people think they feel, but they actually just think about feeling. There's a massive difference between emotion and feeling, and Jung was adamant about this distinction. Emotion is instinctive, raw, a limbic system surge that floods the body. Feeling, on the other hand, is a function of evaluation, a conscious attitude toward that emotional wave. The problem is we often bypass this internal process with abstract labels like sad or anxious without ever really sitting inside the experience. We stay in our heads, spinning narratives, avoiding the gnosis buried beneath the surface. Depth psychology teaches us to drop in, not rationalize our way out. When we ignore this guidance, we end up emotionally congested, overloaded with psychological contents that never metabolize. This is why someone can be working on themselves for years and still feel stuck. They may be journaling, affirming, or even in therapy, but if they're not actually entering the emotional terrain of the unconscious, they're just circling. Emotion must be felt, and feeling must be owned. This isn't theory, it's embodiment. Let me give you a real-life example. Imagine someone says, "I'm angry," but they say it with a flat tone and no bodily awareness. That's not feeling, it's analysis. Now compare it to someone whose chest tightens, whose stomach churns, who allows the emotion to move through them. That's a psychological shift, not just a conceptual one. It's the body's way of bridging inner world and outer world, revealing the psychic image underneath. Real emotional awareness transforms perception and changes behavior. So how do we stop bypassing? Start with breath, then go further. Practice active imagination, as Jung recommended. Visualize the emotion as a being or image. Maybe grief is a gray wolf. Maybe joy is a golden light. Let them speak. These aren't childish games. They're depth tools designed to connect you with psychic reality. Emotion isn't there to be managed. It's there to be met. Feeling is the compass that helps you navigate that meeting consciously. When we finally begin to distinguish emotion from feeling, we gain a new kind of perception, one that connects directly with the unconscious without being overwhelmed by it. This opens the gate to the affect bridge, the path that lets us revisit past ego states, not to relive them, but to re-inhabit and reinterpret them in light of who we are becoming. The affect bridge and accessing past ego states. The psyche remembers what you've forgotten. Beneath your conscious awareness lies a vault of past ego states, each with its own voice, tone, and emotional charge. The affect bridge, as it's often called in depth psychology, is the pathway that lets you revisit those states not just as memories, but as living experiences. It's like stepping into a time capsule of feeling. You don't just recall your teenage heartbreak. You feel the chest tightening confusion of it again. That's where the gold is, not in the facts, but in the emotional truth embedded within. Most of us try to heal by thinking forward, but evolution requires us to turn inward and backward, not regressively, but consciously. Think of this bridge as a mythic return, a movement toward integration. Through the affect bridge, we gather lost parts of ourselves scattered across time. Every shameful moment, every awkward version of you you'd rather erase, still holds a key to your individuation. These fragments aren't mistakes. They're mythological figures waiting for re-entry into your psychic system. So, how does one access this bridge? Art and ritual are excellent starting points. Write a letter to your 7-year-old self. Revisit the music you listened to during a painful breakup. Let those memories trigger sensations. That emotional recall is the key. It opens the doorway between the executive function of the adult ego and the instinctual, often injured, child within. This is more than nostalgia. It's psychological transformation in motion. Your personal myth unfolds through these reconnections. Jung said we don't become enlightened by imagining light, but by making the darkness conscious. The affect bridge makes that possible. When you re-inhabit a past ego state, especially one charged with emotion, you gain new perception about how that part still lives in your unconscious. Maybe the boy who never felt seen now hijacks your adult relationships. Maybe the teen who lost hope still whispers in moments of stress. These aren't pathologies. They're invitations to deeper wholeness. And when you start walking that bridge regularly, something curious begins to happen. The images, instincts, and emotions you retrieve start to feed your creativity. Your myth takes form. It's no longer a story you tell. It's a life you live. But for that myth to truly awaken, it must pass through the body. Movement, rhythm, breath, and kinetic release begin to stir the instinctual energies needed for that integration. Creativity, movement, and emotional activation. When words fall short, the body speaks. Movement, creativity, and image-making aren't just hobbies, they're portals. These actions bypass the rational mind and speak directly to the unconscious, activating the limbic system and awakening instincts long buried under social roles and ego expectations. You don't need to be a dancer or a painter. You just need to move like your inner world depends on it, because it does. Emotional activation isn't just emotional release. It's psychological communication across polarities. Ever notice how kids run when they're excited or scream when they're upset? That's kinetic tantrism in its purest form. Instinctual movement mirroring internal states. As adults, we're taught to suppress that motion, but the psyche never stopped dancing. Creative acts, whether through drawing, singing, or simply scribbling symbols with closed eyes, stir the deeper strata of consciousness. This is how we activate the effect bridge we previously built. It needs movement to stay alive. Let's talk practicality. You wake up feeling emotionally blocked. Don't analyze it to death. Put on music that matches the mood and move your body for 10 minutes. Or grab a pen and start sketching whatever image comes to mind. Don't worry if it makes sense. That imagery is the language of the unconscious. Creativity isn't decoration. It's a psychic necessity. It allows the anima to emerge safely, clothed in form and freed from the prison of abstraction. And yes, this works with emotions that seem irrational. If sadness has no name, or rage arrives without a cause, don't dismiss them. Instead, ask them to show themselves in image or motion. Jungian psychology sees these eruptions as messages, not malfunctions. They are attempts at communication from the depths. When we engage with them through creativity and movement, we activate transformation at the level of instinct, not just thought. This embodied engagement prepares the ground for something sacred, a relationship with the unconscious rooted in trust. But before that relationship can deepen, the unconscious must be approached with intention, an offering of respect that signals you're not just there to take, fix, or manipulate, but to listen. Intention and respect toward the unconscious. The unconscious is not your servant. It's a wild, ancient intelligence that responds to intention, not manipulation. You can't hack it or force it to reveal its treasures. What you can do is signal respect. That begins with setting a conscious intention. It's like knocking before entering a sacred space. The psyche notices that. When the ego approaches with humility instead of domination, the unconscious responds with symbolic gifts instead of resistance or chaos. Think of it this way. If you keep barging into a room where someone's meditating, shouting questions and demands, they're not likely to welcome you. The same goes for the inner world. When you approach it like a predator, looking to mine it for meaning or exploit it for power, it hides. But when you sit quietly, light a candle, breathe slowly, and ask, something shifts. This is why rituals, small, intentional acts matter. They tell your consciousness, I'm here to listen. Try this. Before journaling or meditation, simply state your purpose aloud. Not for theatrics, but for clarity. I want to understand this fear. Or I'm ready to see what I've been avoiding. That's it. This act of naming becomes a psychological compass. It activates a process of adaptation in the unconscious, which begins to offer symbolic responses, dreams, synchronicities, images, even bodily sensations. But you must remain attentive, or you'll miss the answer when it whispers. And remember, this isn't a one-way street. The ego doesn't just send messages, it receives them. Often, they arrive as discomfort, tension, or emotional confusion. Instead of resisting, get curious. What if that tight chest isn't just anxiety, but the anima knocking? What if that recurring dream isn't random, but a form of gnosis? Respect means listening even when the language is unfamiliar. Especially then. That's how trust is built between the ego and the unconscious. When this trust deepens, you begin to sense a shift in your inner architecture. The psyche becomes more cooperative, more revelatory. But there's another layer to this dance, moving beyond passive abstraction and connecting with deeper archetypal realities, like the Platonic form of the Anima. She's not just an idea, she's a living principle. But unless we make that principle real, we risk keeping her at arm's length, stuck in theory. The Platonic Form and the Anima beyond abstraction. The Anima isn't just a concept in a book or a poetic muse in the background of your fantasies. She's a Platonic form, an eternal, living pattern that your psyche recognizes instinctively, even if you've never named it. Jung understood that to truly integrate her, you must do more than think about her. You must meet her. That means pulling her out of abstraction and into embodied experience. Otherwise, you're just intellectualizing something that demands emotional and imaginal presence. The danger of abstraction is seductive. It makes you feel clever, even enlightened, while keeping you safely disconnected. You can debate the idea of the anima endlessly in forums or over coffee, but until she moves in your dreams, sings through your sorrow, or dances behind the eyes of someone you love, you haven't really met her. To transform the inner world, the archetype must become image, emotion, and ultimately, relation. This isn't theory, it's psychological reality. So, how do we make the Platonic form real? Engage the symbolic. Watch films that stir your unconscious. Maybe it's Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind or The Fountain. Pay attention to your dreams, especially those charged with mood or imagery that lingers. Write poetry from the part of you that longs without knowing what it longs for. Draw the face that keeps appearing in your imagination. This is how the form steps forward, through feeling, not logic. When the anima begins to show up like this, she's no longer a projection on your partner or fantasy. She becomes a co-creator in your psyche, helping shape perception, instinct, and purpose. She becomes the bridge between the inner world and outer world. That's why some experiences with her feel overwhelming. They carry the weight of a numinous experience. You're not just processing an idea, you're touching something eternal. That's why reverence is necessary. As this connection deepens, you may notice a split forming. One anima uplifts, the other distorts. This polarity isn't random. It reflects how the positive anima works through the inferior function, while the negative anima sabotages the dominant one. Understanding this split is crucial for psychological adaptation and emotional integrity. Negative and positive anima in ego functions. Here's where things get trickier because the anima doesn't come in just one flavor. She has a dual nature. The positive anima inspires connection, insight, and creativity, while the negative anima sabotages, manipulates, and distorts. Jung observed this polarity expressing itself through our functions. The positive anima often enters through the inferior function, guiding growth, while the negative anima hijacks the dominant function, corrupting what we do best. It's like a glitch in the executive function. Everything works, but nothing feels right. Imagine someone whose dominant function is thinking. When the negative anima infiltrates, their thoughts become rigid, cynical, overly abstract. The world loses beauty. Everything turns into analysis paralysis or contempt. Meanwhile, if the anima enters through their inferior function, let's say feeling, it's an opportunity. She brings warmth, depth, and connection, helping to integrate what was once ignored. That's the secret. The inferior function is a doorway, not a flaw. It's the place where transformation begins. This polarity explains so much about relationship dysfunction. Ever fallen head over heels, only to watch it spiral into projection, control, or despair. That's not love. It's unconscious material running wild. The negative anima turns the outer partner into a battleground for your inner conflict. But once you recognize the pattern, you can work with it. Instead of blaming the other person, you can ask, what part of me is she awakening? What function have I been rejecting? Working with this split isn't about labeling parts as good or bad. It's about becoming conscious. The anima teaches through polarities. She reveals where you're one-sided, where the dominant function has become too inflated, and where the neglected function longs to be seen. This is where psychological homeostasis begins, not by suppressing the negative, but by understanding its role. Even distortion has meaning if you're willing to explore it. And once you start dancing with both sides, acknowledging the muse and the saboteur, you realize just how powerful the anima really is. She holds the keys to your instincts, your perception, even your drive for spiritual development. But beware, if she appears too suddenly, too powerfully, without preparation, the result isn't growth, it's overwhelm. Overwhelm through emotion and numinous experience. Sometimes the anima doesn't knock. She kicks the door in, especially when ignored for too long. She tends to show up not as a whisper, but as a wave. Overwhelm isn't a malfunction of the psyche. It's often a numinous experience crashing through a container that isn't yet ready. It can happen during a spiritual awakening, a profound love, or a moment of inexplicable sorrow. And when it does, it's not just emotion. It's the unconscious flooding into consciousness with mythic force. The limbic system doesn't care if your ego had a plan for the week. It reacts. You cry uncontrollably watching a film, feel manic after meditation, or fall into a trance during sex. These are raw collisions between inner world and outer world, and they're often misunderstood. We call them breakdowns, but in depth psychology, they're breakthroughs in disguise. The psyche is trying to stretch its boundaries, only it forgot to warn your nervous system first. People often feel like they're losing it in these moments, but that loss of ego control is part of the process. You're not supposed to remain the same. Still, overwhelm without anchoring can become trauma. That's why integration matters. When you touch something numinous, don't rush to explain it. Let echo. Take a walk. Draw it. Talk to someone who gets it. Reading Jung or Marie-Louise von Franz during such times can help make sense of what's stirring. What makes these encounters with the anima so potent is that they dissolve the usual categories: time, logic, even identity. She might appear in dreams as a goddess, a child, or a storm. She can show up in lovers, strangers, or symbolic animals. The trick is not to literalize the image, but to relate to it. Ask what it wants from you. What function is being awakened? Which instinct is being called into play? That's where teleology sneaks in. These experiences aren't random. They're purposeful. And if you lean into them, if you listen instead of resisting, something wild begins to awaken. The sense that your instincts are leading you somewhere. Not blindly, but with a mythic intention. And to explore that further, we'll need to look east, toward Tantra practices that have long embraced this marriage between movement, instinct, and spiritual teleology. Eastern parallels, Tantrism and instinctive teleology. If Jung had ever partnered with a tantric yogi, they'd probably agree on one thing immediately. Instincts aren't primitive leftovers. They're teleological blueprints, encoded with purpose and direction. Kinetic Tantrism, particularly, embraces this truth by using movement, breath, and imagery not to escape the body, but to enter it more fully. It's not about enlightenment as escape. It's about embodiment as evolution. That's why this Eastern wisdom fits so seamlessly with depth psychology's view of the unconscious. In Kinetic Tantra practice, every movement is a symbolic act, not just a stretch or a dance. It's a way of communicating with the psyche through the body. Think of it like this. Your instincts speak a language, but it's not verbal. It's rhythmic, sensual, intuitive. When you move intentionally, through breath work, ecstatic dance, or even primal screaming, you unlock mythic energies that have been trapped by social conditioning. You stop thinking your way to God and start feeling your way there. Jung's teleological perspective, that the unconscious is not chaotic, but purposeful, mirrors this tantric truth. The Anima isn't just a random archetype. She's part of a mythic movement within the psyche, leading you toward individuation. But she doesn't speak English or German. She speaks in image, gesture, sensation. That's why these body-based traditions matter. They're functional tools for engaging the unconscious directly, without getting stuck in abstraction or theory. You don't need to join a monastery to start. Begin with 5 minutes of intuitive movement each morning. Let your body lead. Or try a practice like Yoga Nidra, which blends deep relaxation with symbolic awareness. These aren't spiritual fads. They're adaptation mechanisms designed to reawaken your inner guidance. As you align with your instincts, you'll begin to feel them pull you toward your story. Not just a personal narrative, but a mythic one. And that myth doesn't unfold in isolation. It happens in the friction between instincts, archetypes, culture, and ego. To truly understand this dynamic, we have to look at the psyche as a system, one where every part, from the primal to the divine, is in constant negotiation with the world outside and the world within. The system's model: ego, instincts, archetypes, culture. Picture the psyche not as a hierarchy, but as a living system, dynamic, interactive, full of feedback loops. At its center sits the ego, balancing input from instincts, archetypes, and the demands of culture. It's like a diplomat stationed at the border of two worlds, the inner world teeming with unconscious forces and the outer world shaped by societal norms, expectations, and collective projections. When the ego is rigid, that system malfunctions. But when it adapts, it becomes a bridge between realms. This model helps explain why your psychological responses can feel so contradictory. One part of you wants to break free and follow intuition, while another clings to tradition or fears rejection. That's not weakness, it's information. Instincts might be urging growth, while cultural programming demands conformity. Archetypes, meanwhile, might amplify both sides. Think of the hero who wants to rebel versus the caregiver who feels guilt. The ego's role is to hold these tensions without collapsing. Let's make it practical. Imagine you feel creatively stifled at work. On one level, your instinct to create is demanding expression. On another, your cultural setting may prize efficiency over imagination. Then comes the archetype, maybe the trickster whispering rebellion, or the artist longing for release. The ego's task is not to silence the noise, but to interpret it. Through that process, you develop psychological homeostasis, a flexible but coherent identity capable of responding to reality without losing inner integrity. This is why individuation isn't a solo act. You're not just harmonizing inner polarities, you're also navigating the influence of family, media, religion, and society at large. Culture acts as both scaffolding and trap. It provides forms, but also imposes limits. Recognizing this dual role allows the ego to adapt rather than submit. You stop taking every inner or outer demand at face value and start filtering through a deeper self-awareness. And that's where the psychological immune system comes into play. Just like your body fends off viruses, your psyche needs boundaries, permeable enough to evolve, but strong enough to resist toxic narratives. Otherwise, you're either enslaved by unconscious contents or swallowed whole by societal hypnosis. The importance of psychological boundaries. Let's be honest, your psyche is constantly under siege, not just by unconscious material, but by social programming, media saturation, and inherited belief systems. That's why developing a psychological immune system is no luxury, it's survival. Just as your body fends off physical pathogens, your psyche needs defenses against maladaptive ideas and emotional toxins. Without this boundary, you're wide open to manipulation from both external culture and your own unintegrated inner voices. Now, boundaries don't mean building walls. Think of them more like filters: smart, flexible, adaptive. You want to be open to gnosis, synchronicity, even constructive criticism. But you also need to spot when something's hijacking your instinctive intelligence. Ever get stuck in a thought loop after scrolling social media or watching the news? That's a boundary breach. The content wasn't just information. It became an internal narrative that disturbed your psychological homeostasis. Jungian psychology emphasizes that the ego must test all incoming messages, whether they arise from the unconscious or the collective. That's your job, to stay awake. And one powerful way to do this is by strengthening your relationship with feeling, your inner barometer. If something leaves you feeling drained, panicked, or disconnected from your center, it's likely not aligned with your path. Practicing discernment isn't about paranoia. It's about energetic responsibility. Let's talk tactics. Try a psychic hygiene ritual at the end of your day. Light a candle. Reflect on what thoughts or energies felt imposed versus what felt true. Write them down. Reclaim your intention. This simple act begins to rebuild the executive function's sovereignty. You're training your system to recognize when it's being influenced and to reclaim authorship of your experience. Over time, this becomes second nature. And as these boundaries grow stronger, something deeper begins to happen. You no longer react, you respond. You become the still point between the inner world and outer world, capable of conscious transformation rather than unconscious adaptation. That's when the ego steps fully into its evolutionary role, not as a control freak, but as the orchestrator of individuation. Individuation and evolutionary function of ego. The ego wasn't designed to be the villain in your psyche's story. It was meant to evolve. In Jungian psychology, the ego plays a teleological role. It's the interface where instincts, culture, and archetypes negotiate meaning. Individuation isn't just about becoming yourself. It's about becoming a conscious system, one where the personal myth aligns with the larger forces of human development. The ego evolves by integrating what it once feared, dismissed, or projected. That's its sacred task. Picture the ego like a conductor in a cosmic orchestra. The instincts are the bass section, primal, powerful, rhythmic. The archetypes are the brass and strings, timeless themes echoing through generations. Culture adds its own melody, often dissonant but influential. The ego must hold the baton and bring it all into harmony. That's individuation, not perfection, but participation in the mystery of becoming whole. You're not just adapting, you're orchestrating your own unfolding. When the ego fails to grow, it defaults to rigidity or collapse. One becomes either inflated, trapped in grandiosity, or deflated, lost in anxiety and helplessness. But when the ego accepts its evolutionary function, it gains resilience. It no longer fears chaos because it sees chaos as potentiality. It stops fighting instincts and starts listening to them. It doesn't rebel against culture, but redefines its place within it. That's not weakness, it's transformation. Let's ground this. You're faced with a life decision. Move to a new city, leave a job, and a relationship. The ego, in its mature state, asks not just what do I want, but what wants to emerge through me. It consults feeling, notices archetypal patterns, and listens to instinct. That's conscious decision-making. It's not impulsive, and it's not purely rational. It's integrated. When you act from this place, you feel it. Your steps feel aligned, your emotions coherent, your perception sharper. And this isn't a one-time event. It's a lifestyle. Individuation is a process, a rhythm, a practice. But it's fragile. And the biggest threat to that process isn't failure. It's abstraction. When the ego stops engaging and starts theorizing, the unconscious retaliates. That's why the next chapter will bring a sharp reminder. Stay grounded or risk regression into fragmentation. warning against abstraction and regression. There's a silent danger that haunts many spiritual seekers and psychology enthusiasts alike, getting lost in abstraction. You read all the right books, quote all the right thinkers, but the inner work stays dry, disconnected. Jung warned that the psyche, when ignored or approached only intellectually, doesn't just wait patiently, it pushes back. If you treat your inner world like a concept to be solved rather than a mystery to be lived, it retaliates with chaos. Regression isn't failure. It's a warning light flashing at full intensity. Abstraction is seductive. It gives you a sense of control. You think you're integrating, but really, you're circling the airport and never landing. It's safer to analyze your trauma than to actually feel it. It's easier to discuss the anima than to encounter her in a numinous dream that leaves you shaking. But every time you avoid embodiment, you distance yourself from individuation. The unconscious doesn't speak in essays. It speaks in symbols, sensations, and stories. The more you escape into theory, the more the unconscious becomes hostile. This is where psychological maladjustment sneaks in. You feel off, emotionally numb, or filled with inexplicable dread. That's not random. That's a sign you've stopped relating. The psyche is demanding your presence, not your performance. It's like being in a relationship where one person keeps talking about love, but never actually shows up for it. Sooner or later, the other walks out or burns the house down. Here's the fix: embodiment. Real action. If your dream shows you drowning, go swim. If an image keeps repeating, draw it. If the same emotion follows you, give a name and a voice. And yes, it's awkward at first, but awkward is honest. The unconscious doesn't need you to be eloquent. It needs you to be there. Transformation doesn't happen in the head. It happens when the inner world meets the outer one and something moves. And that movement is exactly what the next step demands. Because no matter how much insight you gain, if it doesn't show up in your choices, your habits, your life, it vanishes like a dream at sunrise. The unconscious rewards those who act. Integration isn't complete until the invisible becomes visible, the symbolic becomes kinetic, and the transformation becomes embodied. Integration through action and embodied transformation. Insight without embodiment is like planting seeds and never watering them. You can meditate, dream, and analyze until your ego feels enlightened. But if it doesn't ripple outward into your choices, the unconscious remains untouched. Integration isn't complete until it hits the ground. That means your behavior, your relationships, your routines must begin to reflect the internal shifts you've worked so hard to uncover. Otherwise, it all stays aesthetic, pretty symbols on a shelf, untouched by life. This is where many stall. They confuse transformation with information. But here's the test. Have you acted differently? If your anima revealed a fear of intimacy, did you finally make that call, have that conversation, show up with vulnerability? If you confronted a deep rage in a dream, did you find a healthy outlet for expression, martial arts, primal scream therapy, or even just a brutally honest journal entry? These acts are more spiritual than any mantra recitation done on autopilot. Embodiment isn't about perfection. It's about sincerity. You'll mess up, fall back into patterns, second-guess yourself. That's normal. What matters is that the ego keeps showing up. Feet on the ground, instinct alive, culture in view, and unconscious symbols held with reverence. Integration doesn't look like bliss. It looks like change. And change often starts messy. New boundaries, harder conversations, restructured priorities. But that mess signals movement. You're not circling anymore, you're landing. Try this as a practice. Every time you encounter a powerful dream, image, or emotional insight, ask yourself, what is this asking me to do? Not in a metaphorical sense, but literally. Is it calling you to forgive, create, move, speak, rest, or risk? Then act. Even the smallest step tells the unconscious, I heard you. Over time, this dialogue becomes a dance. You don't just grow, you evolve in motion. You crystallize as you walk. And that's the real miracle. Not floating above life in imagined purity, but walking through it with meaning, purpose, and connection. You become a vessel not just for anima, but for consciousness itself. Still, as deep as this process goes, it always leaves you wanting to know more. Because once the soul learns to speak in symbols, the next question arises, how can I truly marry her? How do I wed the anima, not just conceptually, but spiritually, and live that vow every single day? So now the question's yours to carry. Are you building a life where the anima would want to live? Have your thoughts, choices, and actions truly made room for her presence? Or are you still chasing reflections of her in fleeting relationships and half-lived dreams? The unconscious doesn't care about your intentions. It responds to your embodiment. You spend your life waiting for a sign. This is it. The anima won't settle for a guest room. She wants a throne. Will you build it? Ask yourself, what image keeps showing up in your dreams? What feeling are you afraid to fully feel? What part of you have you silenced because the world said it wasn't manly enough? That's where the treasure is buried. That's the psychic trailhead. And once you start walking it with reverence and courage, everything changes. Your instincts begin to speak. Your feelings find form. Your life stops being random and starts becoming mythic. That's the power of true psychological masculinity. If you're ready to stop circling and start becoming, I invite you to keep walking with us. Subscribe to the channel, activate the notifications, and keep learning how to wed your anima. Not with words, but with action, awareness, and embodied truth. Because the deepest love story you'll ever live is the one between your soul and your psyche.